Yeah, Dubey sir, you can start now.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here again this Sunday morning with the Indore study group. Uh, as you all know, our speaker this morning is Mr. Siddharth Menon. Uh, most of us know him, but in case somebody who is new to the group and is not aware of Siddharth's background, I'll briefly introduce Mr. Siddharth Menon. Uh, Siddharth has been a student of Rishi Valley School, and after obtaining his MA degree in English from Delhi University, Siddharth has spent close to 3 decades in different KFI schools. He has taught in Rajghat, Uttarkashi, and Rishi Valley School. He is currently the director of the Rajghat Education Center and also the Rajghat Basic School. He writes poetry in English and is a trustee of the Krishnamurti Foundation, India. With these words, I will welcome Siddharth to this circle and express my thankfulness uh, for sparing his time with us. And Siddharth is going to talk to us on the urgency of change. So, with these words, I welcome Siddharth once again and request him to please begin your talk. Please unmute yourself. Yeah.
Good morning, Dubey and good morning all. Sorry for the technical glitch. Dubey said I'm going to speak about the urgency of change. Now that sounds very daunting. Now, yes, but that is the subject of this talk. And coincidentally, last week when Shanti spoke, he took up a chapter to read from the book which has that title, The Urgency of Change. Is There a God? That was a sheer coincidence, but a happy one, because some of the things that he spoke about are things that I'd like to refer to in today's talk. Now, one thing I'll say at the outset is I'm speaking from Trivandrum, where it's raining continuously. So it's possible that my connection will be a little unstable. If that happens, please bear with me. I'll rejoin as soon as possible if I get disconnected. One more thing I'll say before I begin is that Sushilji, when he invited me for today's session, asked me to bring in some poetry into the session. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to actually bring a couple of poems, but just very lightly, because the session is not about poetry. It's on the subject of the urgency of change. But I will refer to a couple of poems and share the poems during today's presentation. So I want to thank the Indore Study Circle for inviting me and Dubey for your very kind introduction. I'm going to present my screen because I would like to share some texts with you as we go along. I hope my screen is visible to everybody.
Yes.
Yes, it is.
Yes,
okay.
you are. Yes, you are. Yeah.
So, thank you. So this is the subject, the urgency of change. And here's a quotation from the book, which has the same title. To live in this world sanely, there must be a radical change of the mind and of the heart. Now, this is a stark statement. And there are many things one can say about it, many things one can ask about it. But for the moment, I'm not going to do either. I'd just like to have this statement up for us to look at, and we'll come back to it in a little while. Below that, there are 3 sentences, which I'll just read out. I hope you can read them too. You must change your life. You must begin a different life. It's time your life must change. Now, these three sentences, as you would have noticed, seem to be saying more or less the same thing, though perhaps with slight variations in terms of emphasis and the way they are put. Now, the reason these three lines are saying the same thing, but a little differently, is because there are three different translations of a line in German from a poem. And this brings me to the first poem that I'm going to share with you, which is a poem in German. And I'm going to read it to you in one of the translations, the first of these three translations. Now, the poem is by the poet, the Austrian poet Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke, who died in 1926. And this poem is about, it's a short poem. It's about seeing a statue in a museum and his responses to the statue. So let me show you an image of the statue. So this is the statue. It's, as you can see, it's a broken figure. It's a Greek statue, perhaps about 2000 years old, and in the Louvre Museum in Paris. And Rilke's poem is about his experience of looking at the statue. And in fact, I would say, curiously enough, of being looked at by the statue. And this is the name of the poem, Archaic Torso of Apollo. Apollo, of course, was a Greek god, and the statue is primarily a torso. So I'm going to read the poem and not spend too much time on it, but perhaps draw your attention to a few things in it. We cannot know his legendary head with eyes like ripening fruit. So this is a statue without a head. So we don't know what the head is like. We don't know what the eyes are like. But the poet is obsessed with the eyes, which he says are like ripening fruit. And yet his torso is still suffused with brilliance from inside, like a lamp, in which his gaze, now turned to low, gleams in all its power. So it's as if Apollo's gaze, his looking, is there in the statue, even though the head is not there. Otherwise, the curved breast could not dazzle you so, nor could a smile run through the placid hips and thighs to that dark center where procreation fled. In other words, if the gaze of the statue were not still there, even though the eyes are physically not there, this torso would not dazzle you the way it does. That's what he's saying. Otherwise, this stone would seem defaced beneath the translucent cascade of the shoulders and would not glisten like a wild beast's fur. So it's as if this whole statue is alive like a beast. It would not, from all the borders of itself, burst like a star. For here there is no place that does not see you. You must change your life. So this is where the statue ends, where the poem ends, right? With this startling statement, you must change your life. And why is it that the life must be changed? Apparently because of the look of the statue, a look of such intensity that you cannot escape it. Now, let's go back to these three lines, or rather the same line translated in three different ways. You must change your life. Now, that statement sounds like a command. This is something that you must do. But it could also be a statement of fact. At the end of it all, having been seen by the statue in this way, you just don't have a choice. You must change your life. So it could be a statement of fact, It could be a kind of command. But of course, the question arises, can this be done? And change to what and how? What does it mean to change your life? And is it something that you can do? Now, we'll return to this question later because it's a question that Krishnaji raises. But let me come now to the second translation. You must begin a different life. Now, here, the emphasis shifts a little bit. It's not so much on change, though that is implicit, as on beginning. It's beginning that's emphasized. To begin is everything. It's like, when Krishnamurti says the first step is the last. It's that moment of transition which is the entire change. It's not a beginning that leads somewhere. The beginning is it. The other way in which this is different is the first translation has your life. The second translation has a life, a different life. So it makes it a little less personal. It's something that's more generalized. It's as if it's life, a different kind of life rather than your life. And if we look at the third translation, which is the most recent one, it's time your life must change. Now here you see the focus, the emphasis is on time. It's this moment, a moment has arrived in which your life just has to change. Now, what is this time? In the context of the poem, this time is when you notice that this statue is gazing at you completely, right? Unsparingly. There's no way you can escape the gaze of this statue that doesn't even have a head. And therefore, it's time. Now, again, Krishnamurti is concerned with this question of time. When this happens, the metaphor that he uses often is that of a house on fire. When you see the house is on fire, you don't wait, you don't think, you act. So here are these three different translations. It doesn't matter for our purposes today about which is closest to Rilke's original. That's a question for another time. The point is, they're all speaking of change. It's interesting that this statement comes at the very end of the poem. The poem does not say what the old life was. It does not say what the new life should be. It just says this is a moment of transition. And clearly the transition is linked to the intensity of seeing and a seeing that becomes being seen. It's as if you are being seen in your act of seeing. So I just thought that this sort of takes us in an interesting way to the main question, which is, of course, change. And let me get back now to Krishnaji's sentence that I began with. To live in this world sanely, there must be a radical change of the mind and of the heart. And then the questioner responds, yes, but what do you mean by change? How am I to change if whatever I do is the movement of the past? I can only change myself. Nobody else can change me. And I don't see what it means to change. Now, for me, as I was reading this, it was interesting because these were precisely the kinds of questions which were occurring to me. And there were other questions as well. So for example, when Krishnaji says to live in this world sanely, what does he mean sanely? Or he doesn't just talk about change, he speaks of radical change and of the mind and of the heart. So there are several questions I think that are worth pursuing about this. But let's just see what do we normally understand by the process of change. Now, when we talk of change, we normally mean a change towards something better. We are aware of a condition, let us call it what is, let us call it condition A, and we want a betterment, we want a kind of better what is, let's call that B. So by transition, by change, we mean a movement from A to B through some process which brings about that change. Now, this is a legitimate way of looking at change in many contexts. And I think it's what we experience in our day-to-day lives. Wherever we see something that needs change, we see something that needs to be improved. Let me take a small example from just a personal example. I like running, I'm a runner. And I want to improve my running, which means I want to be able to run the same distances, either run them more comfortably or run them quicker and so on. So I know my condition A, which is my present fitness as a runner. Perhaps I know B in terms of a specific target, which is to be able to run 5 minutes faster. Or maybe B is left somewhat loosely defined. I just want to run better, whether it's 5 minutes or undefined. And there's a process involved in this. I learn exercises, maybe I have a coach, I practice, I train, and hopefully at the end of it, I've moved from A to B. So that is our usual process of change by which our lives are often defined. But the question arises, can this way of looking at change apply to the situation of, let's call it becoming a better human being? Or if we want to take a more radical phrase for this, let us say the ending of the self. Can we apply this kind of transition model from A to B with some process? And straight away we see that there are some problems. The first problem is, do we know A? Now, last time when Shanti was speaking about what is, one of the things he said was that what is perhaps unknowable. We define ourselves in certain ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean we know ourselves completely. We have a hazy notion of ourselves, of some of our characteristics, but those don't really define us. So there's a haziness about what we are. And what about B, the thing where we want to get to? How do we even define that? Let us say what I want is to be in a selfless state. Now, I don't know what that means. I can conceptualize it because Krishnamurti or somebody else has spoken about it. I have some intellectual understanding of it, but I have no idea what that is. It's not a reality in my life. It's speculation based on a certain amount of knowledge. Now here, clearly, what happens is one is creating a division between what is and one's idea of what should be. And as again Shanti pointed out last time, where there is division, there's conflict. So this whole process of trying to get somewhere in this area of, let us say, human growth is inherently riven with conflict because one is aiming at something one doesn't know and striving for it. And there's another problem too, which is there's you. There is this you who says, I need to be better than what I was. So this whole process of ending the self becomes, funnily enough, a way of strengthening the self, of redefining the self in terms that we prefer. So it's paradoxical, it's bound to fail, and we get nowhere when we attempt to go about it in this way. Now, what can we do then? What do we do with this whole notion of change and Krishnamurti's statement that there needs to be change? I'd like to come to two things, paradox and perception, and share two passages. Any movement from what I am strengthens what I am. So change is no movement at all. Change is the denial of change. And now only can I put this question, is there a change at all? This question can be put only when all movement of thought has come to an end. For thought must be denied for the beauty of non-change. In the total negation of all movement of thought away from what is the ending of what is. And the second passage, you keep on looking at things with eyes that want to interfere, that want to do something about what they see. Stop doing anything about it, for whatever you do belongs to the traditional approach. That's all. Be simple. This is the miracle of perception. To perceive with a heart and mind that are completely cleansed of the past. Negation is the most positive action. Now, these statements that Krishnaji makes about seeing and about perception and change, which is no change, look paradoxical to us. And it's worth trying to understand why they feel paradoxical. First of all, these statements appear to be illogical. What does it mean to say change is no movement? After all, we define change in everyday life as involving movement. Or change is the denial of change. Or then at the very end, negation is the most positive action. Negation is positive. How do we make sense of statements of this kind? The problem seems to be, as I said, one, we find these illogical. And secondly, I think we are habituated to think in terms of effort and achievement. That's how we learn, that's how we are taught in school, that's how we accomplish change. We put in effort, and at the end of it, we hope to see a result. There is a certain achievement. And here Krishnamurti is saying, stop doing anything, right? In other words, cease effort. Now, this goes completely against the grain of the way in which we are habituated to act and perhaps to think. And so it's very hard to make sense of this. I remember when I was in school in Rishi Valley, when I was in junior school, in our report cards, we used to get 2 grades. There was 1 grade for effort and another grade for achievement. So even in a school like Rishi Valley, right, this is how we were being taught to grow. I'm certainly not finding fault with Rishi Valley. There's obviously a place for effort and achievement in learning, even in school learning. The point I'm trying to make is that this becomes very central to the way we understand learning and growth. And therefore, a statement like change is the denial of change, for example, is very hard to make sense of, right? As I said, it sounds paradoxical. We don't know what to do with it. So let me come to another statement, which is also about perception, what Krishnaji called the miracle of perception. We always look at things partially. Firstly, because we are inattentive, and secondly, because we look at things from prejudices, from verbal and psychological images about what we see. So we never see anything completely. Even to look objectively at nature is quite arduous. To look at a flower without any image, without any botanical knowledge, just to observe it becomes quite difficult because our mind is wandering, uninterested. And even if it is interested, it looks at the flower with certain appreciations and verbal descriptions, which seem to give the observer a feeling that he has really looked at it. Deliberate looking is not looking. So we really never look at the flower. We look at it through the image. Now, for those of us who are familiar with Krishnaji's way of speaking, this passage sounds utterly familiar. And it's easy to overlook this paradox, this central paradox, which is in this passage as well. Deliberate looking is not looking. In fact, Krishnaji elsewhere in the same chapter makes a distinction between looking and seeing, where he says that seeing is an action of time. Looking is an action through time, which we try and do, whereas seeing is something that happens instantaneously. So deliberate looking is not looking. Now, again, to go back to another memory from my childhood in Rishi Valley, when I remember vividly when Krishnaji spoke to students in the auditorium in the assembly hall at Rishi Valley, which is a very beautiful structure. It's an open structure without walls and only pillars. So when you sit inside, you can look all around. Krishnaji would point to the plants outside, the trees, and maybe a flower on a bush, and say, can you look at that tree? And then he would say, can you look at it and not name it? Can you just look at it without thinking anything about it? Now, as a child, I took that question very seriously and quite literally. And I remember trying very, very hard to look at a tree without thinking about it. I think if I had been graded, I would have gotten an A for effort, but perhaps an F for achievement. Because the more I tried to look at that tree without thinking about it, more thoughts were coming in. So what does one do? Perception is something that you can do nothing about. It's not even something that you can do deliberately, right? What is it that we can do? Before I address that, it's just worth mentioning there are many interesting things that Krishnaji says about perception, even in this chapter in the book. He says, for example, that to perceive one problem completely is to understand all problems. And he also says that perception is instantaneous. It's not something that requires time. It happens instantly. Now, I don't want to go into these questions. I'll just make one comment really about perception, which seems to come through very clearly, which is that it seems to have nothing to do with knowledge. Perception doesn't arise from knowledge as we usually understand knowledge. On the contrary, it appears as if it's in a state of non-knowledge, perception might begin to arise. So we understand this, but then what do we do with it? Is there any kind of progress that one can make, or is that the wrong question? And I realize that I simply don't know. I don't know what to do with this. I don't know how to go forward. So this whole business of knowledge, and you are at times left with the realization that you don't know, is something that I'd like to now pursue a little further. This question of not knowing. He spoke about this as well in some length last week. He spoke about it in the context first of human relationships. He said, when you tell a person, I know who you are, you lost him. You don't know who that person is. Your knowledge is partial. Your knowledge is not what is. And I would say that about oneself. If I say I know what I am, I have again perhaps lost the truth. Anything I say about myself may be at best a partial truth. Certainly it's incomplete. Certainly it's not the whole story. And therefore, almost any label I use, which is a form of knowledge, seems to be untrue. And yet we constantly seek knowledge. And we seek knowledge out of insecurity. Having labels, having knowledge is what makes us feel that we've understood something. And we don't realize that what we've understood is perhaps untrue. Therefore, to remain in a state of non-knowledge or not knowing becomes so important. And it's at this point that I'd like to share the second poem from today. And this is a poem by a Polish poet called Wisława Szymborska, whose poetry I often go back to. And this is a wonderful little poem she's written called Some People Like Poetry. And it's a poem in 3 stanzas. In the first stanza, she defines what some people means. In the second stanza, she defines what like means. And in the third stanza, she looks at what poetry means. So some people like poetry. And that's what gives the poem its structure. The poem, as you'll see, looks very simple, almost casual. But again, it's the end of the poem that I'm really interested in. And I think she's saying something very important in it. So this is Szymborska's poem. Some people, that means not everyone, not even most of them, only a few, not counting school where you have to, and poets themselves, you might end up with something like 2 per 1,000. Like. But then you can like chicken noodle soup, or compliments, or the color blue, your old scarf, your own way, petting the dog. Poetry. But what is poetry anyway? More than one rickety answer has stumbled since that question first was raised. But I just keep on not knowing, and I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. I'll just read those last 2 lines again. But I just keep on not knowing, and I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. So the poet is saying at the end of this poem that she doesn't know how to define poetry. Now, when you say I don't know something, it can arise from many sources. It can be, and usually often is, a kind of admission. You know, I admit I don't know something. It's like a sign of something is wrong. I don't know something which I ought to know, right? And here's a poet saying, I don't know how to define poetry. But look what she says about it. I just keep on not knowing. She's not trying to get out of that state of not knowing. And I cling to that like a redemptive handrail. In other words, the handrail, which is something that gives you support, this not knowing is a source of strength. It's not a source of weakness, but a source of strength. And I think that's a profound insight. And so when we say we don't know what to make of Krishnji's paradoxes, or statements like change is no change, or we don't know where to begin, or we don't really understand ourselves, I don't think these are admissions of something being wrong or something being amiss. I think if we see that this not knowing can in fact be a source of strength, because it can be the beginning of a journey, the beginning of inquiry. I think it's important to emphasize that not knowing could also be a lazy not knowing. I don't know something and it's too much of an effort to find out, so I don't care. But here it's not that. Here there's interest, there's alertness, and yet a recognition that here is something I don't know, and it's not a problem. In fact, if anything, it's a source of strength that I don't know. Now, the question I'd like to ask now, and this is the last part of my presentation, I hope I'm not taking too long, is this condition that Szymborska speaks about, not knowing, which incidentally, I see this as a kind of manifesto for her. It's as if this is what poetry is. This is where poetry begins. And I would say it's a manifesto not only for poetry, for her mission as a poet, but a kind of manifesto for life. This is where life is, in not knowing. So the question I'd like to raise now is this knowledge, paradoxically, I'm calling it knowledge, or is this connection with not knowing something that only artists possess? Is it something that belongs to the realm of poetry, art, music? Or is it something that everybody can touch? And this brings me to a quotation I'd like to share with you from a very interesting chapter in the book, The Urgency of Change, Beauty and the Artist. And here's a short paragraph, short passage I'd like to share with you. Without love, there is no art. When the artist is playing beautifully, there is no me. There is love and beauty, and this is art. This is skill in action. Skill in action is the absence of the me. Art is the absence of the me. But when you neglect the whole field of life and concentrate only on a little part, however much the me may then be absent, you are still living unskillfully, and therefore you are not an artist of life. Now, this is such an interesting passage. He begins with the word love, which I won't go into right now. I'll come back to it a little later at the very end. But there are two things he seems to be saying here. One is that in the moment of art, the me seems to disappear. There's no me. And he calls this skill in action. So the me goes through the act of art. But the second thing he says is, and he says it more explicitly in another passage in the same chapter, this doesn't mean that the artist is a selfless human being, because the artist may also want to propagate his or her work, may want to be known. The rest of the artist's life might be full of contradiction, confusion, conflict. So the fact that the me goes at times during the process of art doesn't mean that the artist's life is being lived that way. Now, I think this is utterly true. And I'd like to speak just very briefly from my own experience. I can't claim to be an artist, but I do try and write poetry. And I know there are times when I'm writing, when I'm working on a poem, when I'm completely unconscious of myself. At that time, wrestling with words, with authenticity, with trying to capture an experience, it's the poem that's important. It's the act of allowing the poem to come into being that's important. What happens later doesn't seem to matter, and I'm not conscious of myself at all at that moment. The me does seem to disappear. I'm not conscious of it when it's happening, but later I realize that that's what seemed to have happened. It doesn't happen every day, but it does happen. But I also know that part of my engagement with poetry, I'm also wondering whether the poem will make sense to others. Somewhere I would like approval or appreciation, especially maybe from other poets, perhaps recognition. And all of that, of course, is very much centered in the me. So when Krishnaji says that the process of art, in the process of art, the me goes, but that's not all of life, I think it's completely and utterly true. So the artist is not necessarily a selfless being, but might experience the withering of the self at times. But then the next question is this the prerogative of the artist? Is it only to the artist that this happens? And now I'd like to come to the last passage for today, and I'm returning to Szymborska, but this time not to a poem. Szymborska was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1996. And the tradition is that the Nobel laureate has to give a lecture. And she gave a lecture, which is a very wonderful essay called The Poet and the World. And she talks in that essay about how sometimes people ask her about inspiration. You know, we talk about an artist being inspired. And so people ask her as a poet, what does inspiration mean? And then she responds to that question of what inspiration is. Inspiration is not the exclusive privilege of poets or artists generally. There is, has been, and will always be a certain group of people whom inspiration visits. It's made up of all those who've consciously chosen their calling and do their job with love and imagination. It may include doctors, teachers, gardeners, and I could list 100 more professions. Their work becomes one continuous adventure as long as they manage to keep discovering new challenges in it. Difficulties and setbacks never quell their curiosity. A swarm of new questions emerges from every problem they solve. Whatever inspiration is, it's born from a continuous, I don't know. And this, of course, is what she was speaking about in that poem as well. There aren't many such people. Most of the Earth's inhabitants work to get by. They work because they have to. They didn't pick this or that kind of job out of passion. The circumstances of their lives did the choosing for them. Loveless work, boring work, work valued only because others haven't got even that much, however loveless and boring. This is one of the harshest human miseries. So, Szymborska's answer to the question of, is this something that is the prerogative of artists alone, is very clearly no. You don't have to be an artist. You could be doing whatever you're doing. But if you're doing your work with what she calls love and imagination, so coming back to the word love that Krishnamurti also uses, if you're doing your work with that kind of engagement, involvement, passion, let us say, that is inspired. And I would say, I think it's important, you know, this disappearance of the self at times. I think it's important not to make a mystery of it and to think of it as some unattainable other which only, you know, Ramana Maharshi and Krishnamurti, other people in history seem to have had in their lives. I would like to say that I think we all know this state at times, though we may not be conscious of it when it happens. The issue is that we are seeking for it to remain with us. And then, of course, there's conflict and all of that because we realize that we are not always in that state. And it's clearly linked as Szymborska establishes to this recognition that I don't know is not a weakness, but is the beginning of inquiry. And finally, as Santi did last time, I'd like to end with a few comments very briefly on education. I think it's for this reason that it's so important that in education, we are concerned with helping children to discover what they love to do. Because then, if that becomes a quest for them to understand what it is they love to do, the chances that they'll be living their lives wholesomely and without conflict, and perhaps at times with an abeyance of, all the other things that make us work, then perhaps there's a chance that their lives will move in that direction. In fact, in Krishnamurti on education, in one of the conversations that Kay has with students, he asks the students, are your teachers helping you to find out what you love to do? If not, ask them why they are not doing that. This becomes the most important thing. And it's linked to all these other questions that we've been speaking about today. The other thing which I feel that education needs to do is to help us see that learning is not based only on knowledge, effort, and achievement. Now, here again, a lot of our work in school is in fact based on knowledge, effort, and achievement. And they're necessary. They're necessary for everyday life as well. But I think it's very important that we see as teachers and children also somewhere feel that learning is also open-ended and that not knowing is also a source of learning. It's not only about moving from knowledge to greater knowledge. So I think I should stop here, and I'm sorry if I've taken a little longer than I should have. I'll stop sharing the screen. So thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth. I wish you could have taken a little longer. You have placed it so beautifully and clearly. I have no words to explain. I think the change, and especially the way you brought in the poetry along with Krishnaji's statements, it was wonderful. I think, as you rightly said, most of us have experienced that state of not knowing, not out of arrogance, as you mentioned, or laziness, but a state where you are just humble and you really feel that you don't know. I think that is a state what Krishna talks about is starting from the other shore. That is a state of creativity. I think I'll thank you a lot for bringing it up so well. But I leave it to others to say something. Professor Krishna, Harshji, and I think Harshadji has already raised his hand. So we'll begin with Professor Krishna, go to Harshji, and then to Harshad Parekh. Professor Krishna, sir. Sir, unmute yourself.
I was totally taken up with what Siddharth was saying. And so I really have no comment in my mind. It was very profound and very enlightening to hear this connection with poetry and art and Krishnamurti's teachings. Everything that Siddharth pointed out seemed to me to be true. Having been with Krishnaji's teachings for something like 60 years, one finds greater and greater depths in the understanding of the teachings. It's endless. And this whole approach of not only approaching the teachings, but of approaching life itself with this state of not knowing is really freedom from the self. Because the self is made up of knowledge, of conditioning, of thoughts, and not knowing breaks that chain. Whether it happens momentarily on occasions, or it can be a permanent state, I don't know. But I have seen Krishnaji live that way and not be influenced by the past. I have tested him on that. In his relationship with Rajgopal, in his problems with the Arundels, and with the Theosophical Society. Was he affected by the happenings of the past, or he was open? And I checked on that. And every time I found he was completely open, inquiring again, afresh. And that was an innate part of his being. So a man like that represents to us what is possible for any human being. One may not come to that, but to have that question in your mind itself is a challenge. And I think that is the value of the teaching, that it leaves you with questions and not with answers. I think I'll end it there.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Can we go to Harshji now?
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Is
Yes.
that okay?
Yeah.
Well, first, let me thank you, Siddharth, for coming at this question of the urgency of change from such an interesting and evocative angle, very different from the way people normally talk about these things, and particularly the poetic insight that you brought to it. So maybe so many things I would like to talk about, but because you raised very, very many interesting points. Let me start with poetry. See, I was interested that you were saying that when we read what Krishnaji has to say, and sometimes it seems illogical or paradoxical, or that it doesn't make sense, at least it doesn't make sense in the ordinary way of looking at things, which is that when we try and take it literally, when we talk about change, and we know that change literally means the change from one state to another. So there are two different states and you go from one state to another. So, but I would suggest that because of the difficulty of words being limited, that Krishnaji is always speaking poetically, that actually you have to not take Krishnaji literally, because that is what a poet does. He uses even things that are illogical or paradoxical or don't seem to make sense immediately, but when you look through them, they raise images and responses in your thinking that begin to point and lead towards the meaning of the poem. So the poet is playing with words, sometimes using just their sound or just even the juxtaposition on the page to get across something that is beyond the words, something that is not the literal meaning of the words. And I think Krishnaji is doing that. So in that sense, and I must admit, I have often, when reading Krishnamurti, looked at it as poetry. And even when going through texts of Krishnamurti with students, as if I was going through a poem, looking at every line, looking at what lies behind it, trying to understand why he's saying what he's saying. And so, to put it very simply, I would say that Krishnaji's mode of speaking is actually poetical, and we need to treat it as such. So another thing that struck me very much is what you were saying about not knowing. The very phrase, I don't know. And Szymborska's Nobel Prize speech, if I can quote from the same speech, she goes on to say, this is why I value the little phrase, I don't know, so highly. It's small, but it flies on mighty wings. It expands our lives to include the spaces within, as well as those outer expanses in which our tiny earth hangs suspended. So she's very clearly pointing to not knowing as a way that connects us with ourselves, the spaces within, and not just the outer expanses in which the earth is suspended, in which the physical world is. So I think that is an important factor of which connects with what Krishnaji sense of the importance of understanding ourselves, that the I don't know, not knowing, begins to reveal to us what is within us, as well as what is outside of us. So, and this not knowing, and if I can now come to a completely different thing, because I noticed you didn't say very much about urgency of change. So the urgency part of this. And I thought I would say something about urgency in a very different way from what people sometimes speak about this urgency, or the feeling we have. Urgency means something we must do, we must have, like the Rilke poem that you quoted. Yeah? This idea that change means going from one state to another state, something different. But Krishnaji is fairly clear that he's talking about change that does not take place in time. Now, a lot of people who talk over here, Harshad Ji, Dubey Ji, Professor Krishna, they're all physicists, as am I. So we all know about instantaneous change. We all know about this idea. How can you, to measure this, to see that something is moving, you have to see it at two different times. So what do you mean by I'm going at this speed now? Because if I just look at now, nothing is changing. Nothing is changing in an instant. In an instant, nothing changes. So what is meant by instantaneous change? And yet Krishnaji seems to be saying that the change that he's talking about only takes place in the now. It's not going to take place tomorrow, and it didn't take place in the past. And the only time that the change takes place is in the present. At this moment, right now, as we are speaking, the change takes place now. So I just put that as another meaning of the word urgency, that the urgency of change is that it is in an instant, that it is instantaneous. So I think that is all I want to say.
Thank you, Harshji.
Yeah.
I think we can take the comment or question from Harshad Bhai. Please go ahead.
Yeah, are you able to hear my voice?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Siddharth and Professor Krishna and Harsh. When we say change from what to what, then that Sanskrit sloka, which comes to my mind, which everybody chants, even in the school assembly in Rishivali and Rajghat, Asato ma sadgamaya, tamso ma jyotirgamaya, mrityu ma amrutam gamaya. So our life, which we live, daily life, if it is full of problems like fear or anger or jealousy, then to go from that, from this shore to the other shore, where there is real love, beauty, happiness, creativity, that kind of change I feel that Krishna ji is talking about. Now, change, generally we don't like to change because we are in certain state and we are afraid to go out, like going from one country to the other country where we don't know anything about that. So there is a fear comes, we don't want to change. In my case, I had some kind of imagination about going to America first time in 1969, and a kind of a false confidence. But when the plane came to London and then Paris and then New York, a fear started coming. And then I went through many problems of this change. But then I came to Krishna ji. And before coming to Krishna ji, I was feeling very lonely in a different culture. I used to go to church because I was interested. I had no friends, and I found that these Christian people were very friendly. But then I found that they wanted to change me from Hindu to Christianity. And then I came to Krishna ji, and then I began to see very clearly the problems which were arising in me. And then I began to be very confident in expressing my views. And I wrote a letter to the editor. And in that, I expressed how Christian people, they want to convert foreign students to Christianity, people who are of different religion. And then I wrote something about that a real thing is within us. We don't need to go anywhere. The heaven is within us, and we have to look within the hell which we have, understand, see it very clearly. And then something like that I wrote, and the editor, he gave the title Heaven via Hell. And I think that is true, that before we come to something very beautiful, and we have to go through seeing very clearly what are the problems which we have. And we don't try to escape. Generally, we try to escape from the problem which are there and try to justify. But when we begin to see clearly through a different dimension, not through thinking, and that is this came to me when Harsh was talking about it, that we live in the plane of thinking and feeling, and all our thoughts are coming from that and it remains there. But sometime some change happens and we come out from that plane of thinking and feeling, and we come above and then look at thinking and feeling from that dimension of awareness. And then we can really see how everything, our problems are arising. And so the real change is going from thinking and feeling to awareness, which is in a different dimension, which can see everything very clearly. And then there is a kind of freedom, freedom from the known. And but one can also live in the known, but with a different dimension. So about the urgency part, if a person is really interested very, very deeply, then the whole energy is given to look at the source from where the thinking is starting. And in that, sometimes one can come out from it. And once we come out it, we see the beauty of it. And then we work on it, and then it may become a kind of our nature to look at everything from a source which is not thinking and feeling. So one can look at a tree or a flower or a human being, and even can look at the thoughts and feelings arising. So that seems to me the real change, uh, going from thinking, feeling to non-verbal awareness. Thank you.
Thank you, Harshad Bhai. Thank you. We'll take a question from Mr. Dinesh Waghmare. Please go ahead. Then Shailesh ji.
Are you able to listen to me, sir?
Yes.
I don't want to put any question. I would like to give my views on this, and then I would like to ask Mr. Siddharth's views on this. Basically, we are talking of change and urgency of change. The change, what we are talking, why do we require a change at all? To me, actually, the question for immature mind is how I can be better tomorrow, or how I can be better in coming time, or in a few days. But for a mature mind, the question really is how he can be free from the bondage. How he can be free from the bondage. So the ego or the self is not at all a problem for me. On the contrary, that is what I am. And actually, the main problem is when I go for my pursuit, as he was mentioning about the scientist and other people. When I go for my any endeavors and I find the problems in it, and I came to know that I am limited, and I am having so many troubles and frustrations and all the rest of it problems in my life. Then only I will try to find out how it can be better. But when I go deep and I see that the real problem is not this thing, my limitations are the real problems, and the real problems are, and what I do not know, this is fact for me. This is not a thing which I have to do any assumption or I have to think, but I do not know, I am limited, this is a fact for me. So when I go in further deep, then I find that the real problem is bondage. How this ego can be limitless, or how it can be free from everything. And when he goes for it, then he finds that the basic problems is not the freedom per se, but the basic problem is I itself is a problem, and it is limited. So, and all the conditionings are creating a problem for the I. So and urgency of the change. So what change is required? Actually, the freedom from the ego is the real change which is required. And why this urgency? Question of urgency. The intensity of the bondage, or the severity of the bondage, or the how much bondage is making him making the things necessary to change, that will decide the urgency. The more the ego is in trouble or is cornered, more intense he will be for the freedom. And I think then only the urgency of change, the question arises. Otherwise, if I satisfied at his place, complacent, then there is no problem. What Siddharth ji has to say on this?
Well, I'm not sure what the central point was, but I'll try and respond. I was saying that how we say, I don't know, can vary a great deal. I don't know can be an admission of defeat, but I don't know can also be a source of strength and the beginning of inquiry. And so when you say that you see degrees of bondage, and the amount of bondage is what determines the urgency. Maybe I don't really have a comment on that. Yeah, some problem?
Your voice is
I would
breaking.
only like to, yeah, okay. I'd only like to say that if one sees bondage and postulates a state of non-bondage and says that's where to get, I think that is probably self-defeating, because there's a conflict between what one thinks one sees and some concept one has of an ideal. So I don't really have anything further to say on that.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Pradeep Verma now, and then Harshdi, then Shakti Kumar. I think that is all we have time to take. Yes, Pradeep ji, please unmute yourself.
Yes. Yes. Audible, I think. Yes. Siddharth ji, thank you very much for sharing beautiful poetry by Szymborska and Rainer Maria Rilke. I will also share one line from Rainer Maria Rilke that says, everything beacons to perceive it. Everything beacons to perceive it, murmurs at every turn, remember me. This line impressed so much. I was so much impressed. It has that sound, the murmur, remember, beacons, perception. So, and the connectivity, how nonverbal communication, a number of things I could find in this one line. Anyway, now I turn back to the topic today, this urge of urgency. This urgency is definitely based on the intensity of pain or suffering one undergoes while observing, experiencing things around him or inside him. Certain questions came to my mind. How much it is related to likes and dislikes? Is this feeling without motive? Is it passion without motive? All these questions have come to my mind because these things have been through negation, that there should not be a motive, there should be passion. Passion has to be there with no motive. In this change, urgency of change, and where is it felt? Obviously, in individual, this is felt. An individual, rest of it is always there, that he works in that limited mind and all that. But he probably was talking about the change in human consciousness, whether it starts from the individual and goes to society or whatever it is, but starts with the individual anyway. Transformation of consciousness. This starts from the change from what is, because we have been always reading that you should be with what is. So this is a change from what is to something unknown, or still something that can create a harmony in the disturbed psyche. So that sort of imagination we can have. about consciousness is content of consciousness. Through him only I know this. So these are certain questions that have come to me because different people, seers who could see and feel this urgency of change historically, usually prescribed polar opposites to set right the balance. Then came seers who framed certain questions for seekers to gain that wisdom. Maharshi, Siddharth Maharaj, and J.K. himself, because as Krishnaji said, he gave questions, he gave profound inquiries to us that see in yourself all these in this light of these inquiries. So this is what came to my mind after mulling over this question of urgency of change. So I'll be happy to get something from Siddharth on this.
Thank you, Pradeep ji. Thank you.
Yeah, first, thank you for sharing that line of poetry, Mr. Verma. It was very beautiful. You said you'd like something from me. I think you've had 40 minutes from me at the beginning. I don't know if I really have anything to add. I think these are complex questions that you've raised and complicated responses, and I frankly don't have a simple response to them. I would end up repeating perhaps what I've already said, but I'm interested. So one of the points you raised is the question of motive. I mean, why is one even looking at these questions? And I think it's subtle, because of course, when there is a motive, then the self is already there. And, with the aim of betterment or whatever it is. But the relationship between motive and doing something out of so-called pure passion or non-motive is again subtle. You sort of segue between the two very easily. So it's complex. I don't think I can give a simple sort of response to that.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think Dr. Shailesh Shirali wants to make a comment. Shailesh ji, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Siddharth, for bringing out the central role played by, this question of what do I know, and the whole role played by the known. And actually, it is perhaps one of the most central problems of all, the fact that the known has such a powerful hold on us, that our whole lives are spent in the boundaries of the known and simply pushing it in various directions. And whatever we think is the unknown is just an extension of, it's just a modification of the known. And our whole desire for more experience, our pursuit of sensations, our desire for excitement, and in a way, some of the biggest problems of the day all ultimately derive from this one source of that we are trying to simply create a world for ourselves in which the known, we are simply caught in the boundaries of the known. And I think it is no accident that one of the books of Krishnaji is called Freedom from the Known. So what you have pinpointed here is the vital importance of this question and the great challenge, even in a very small matter, to be able to say, I don't know. In a simple matter of looking at an everyday object around us, looking at a person, to be actually able to say in all honesty that I don't know, and to find out what happens in the mind when we really say that in complete honesty. I think in a way the
this thing is, the answer to this is right at hand, because it is really, in one way, it is something so simple, and in other way, it is something so complex. So perhaps that is part of the mystery of it. To be able to really say, I don't know, on the one hand, it's something so simple to do. It's an innocent mind will naturally say, I don't know, and not be ashamed of it, not be frightened of that state, not try to move away from it in any way. But I think it's perhaps the greatest problem of our times. And that line which Harshad, you quoted, Asatoma Sadgamaya, it's in one way, can we find, moving from the unreal to the real? Can the nature of the unreal be revealed to us? What we take to be the real, this known, which we have such security, such confidence in, to realize that it is actually just a veneer, it's just an illusion that we are looking at. So I think it's the central problem of our time, and perhaps it's appropriate that you have focused on just this one phrase in a talk called The Urgency of Change. So thank you.
Thank you, Shailesh ji.
Yeah, thank you,
Siddharth, you want to
Shailesh.
say something?
I think, yeah, just very briefly, thank you for that. And also for emphasizing, as I understood it, the honesty with which one recognizes one doesn't know. I don't know can become another formula. And there has to be a simplicity and genuineness about it for it to be true, and for it to lead to learning and inquiry and so on. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Siddharth. We'll hear from Harsh ji, then Shakti ji, and finally Ravi. Yeah, Harsh ji.
Yes, I want to respond to what Dinesh ji was saying about the urgency of change, that the more we see the problems, the sorrows, the misery, the more urgent it becomes for us. But I would suggest that we actually do see the problems and the difficulties, and on every level, even on the level of health or on the level of relationships, or looking at the world and seeing misery and wars and suffering and all of that, we do see them. But what the brain tends to do is to escape, that we then find ways to escape. We find ways to, and that blunts the urgency of all of these things, whether it's through drink, whether it's through entertainment, whether it's, or we find, and society is built on that. Society is built on helping each other to escape the immediacy of the suffering and the misery that actually, if we allowed ourselves to perceive, would makes our life very difficult. But as Harshad ji was saying, we have to go through hell. And if we do not stay with the hell, if we do not try and escape, then there's never going to be change. And the urgency gets lost.
Thank you, Harsh ji. Thank you. Shakti ji, please unmute yourself, and you want to say something. Yeah.
Yes, sir. My voice is reaching, sir.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. You see, if one reads the parts of K's discourse, where K seems to be suggesting a correlation between awareness and thought in abeyance, this reader might draw some sort of conclusion against thought. At a few other places, for example, talking about good habits and bad habits, K says one has to be aware, thoughtful, not behaving thoughtlessly. if one has read only the part of his literature where he's equating awareness with the quietness of psyche, that reader might miss the point that K is in no way suggesting a thoughtless life. To be thoughtful and yet to be exploring the limitation of thought seems to be the message. Would it mean that one needs to study K's message a bit extensively, even if one wishes to grasp it at least intellectually? Thanks.
I would say, Shaktiji, thought is one, memory is another, knowledge is a third, and we've been speaking today about knowledge. Now, all of these, Krishnaji sort of points out the limitations of, and even the dangers of, but he also points out the importance of these things. They all have their place. They all have spheres in which they are necessary. Of course, if you take, a particular passage of Krishnamurti out of context and feel that that represents all of his thinking about a subject, it can be misleading. So I think, as you said, yes, it's important if one is serious to read more widely and try and understand the totality of what he's saying. But I think a serious person, a serious inquirer would do that, because a serious inquirer would naturally be led to the question of, for example, if knowledge is limited, or if knowledge comes in the way of inquiry, does it mean all knowledge is useless? And so in inquiring into that question, you would realize that that's not what Krishnamurti is saying. So I think, yes, I think if one is serious about inquiry, one has to go into these questions deeply, carefully, and not sort of become, unitrack about them by taking one thing or the other out of context.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you. We'll take the last question now from Ravi Uttarkashi. Ravi, please go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. The urgency of change. These two words penetrates my mind and frustrate me a lot. Whenever I read these two words or hear those words, I do not able to understand the meaning of those two words, what urgency he is talking about and what change he is talking about. Change in society? No. Change in myself, I do not think that I should change myself, because as per my personal experiences, I tried to change the world, change the society, and ultimately understood that I cannot change myself as well. So I am not in favor of changing myself. And what urgency? Whenever there is a crisis, whenever there is suffering, I cry and feel that I need to get out of this life. And after that, the moment has passed, I am again in the same loop, waiting for something, and getting myself entertained. As Harshadji says that we are in loop of entertainment. Entertainment gives us the physical context, a physical contact that we are having something, and this unknown is so miserable and so mystery that we are not able to understand it. So my question is, what urgency and how to get that urgency about the change, and what the change is he's talking about?
See, I think that it's important to try and see to what extent this is a real question for us. It's a nice phrase, the urgency of change. And as you said, one may not feel a living connection with it, because one may be living one's life in a way in which one deals with problems. So what I would say is that here is Krishnaji who is saying something about it, and we have our own understanding. Perhaps we recognize that there are limitations in understanding. Perhaps we recognize there are things about it and are exploring what this means actually, what does change actually mean? And if our personal experience is that we don't sense any urgency about it, so be it. I don't think we should adopt urgency as a kind of mandate because Krishnamurti is speaking about it. I think one can look at one's life. At some point, the question might become an urgent one, or it might not.
Thank you, Siddharth. I think we can close now. We're a little bit beyond our time. I want to thank Siddharth once again for a beautiful presentation. And just to make an announcement, next week on Sunday, we have Michael Cronin. He'll be speaking to us on a subject we'll circulate. And the time of his talk would be 9:30 a.m. just to accommodate because he'll be talking to us from Ohio, California. So next Sunday we meet at 9:30 a.m. And with these words, I thank you all once again, especially Siddharth. Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dubey. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Please end it.
Yeah.
Okay.